Welcome back and welcome to the conference. I'd like to add my welcome to that you received in the last session. My name is Betsy Griffin. I am a member of the John N. Gardner Institute, a different Gardner than the John Gardner that was referenced in the last one, but one that many of you know. So I want to ask, first of all, how many of you were at this conference last year? All right, so quite a few of you were. I know from those statistics we see, we have a lot of new attendees every year. Today I'm going to talk about a survey that we did last year, and it was a survey on the perspectives of transfer professionals on improving transfer. So I'm going to start off with just a tiny bit of the background of this survey, a little bit about the institutions who responded, or the what the professionals said about their institutions anyway, and what they said about institutions that were transfer friendly, and a little bit about what they said about collaborations and state policy. So that's kind of the idea here. And so on to the background of this survey. The reason that the Gardner Institute conducted this survey last year is we had a grant from the Gates Foundation to look into what kinds of things that might be done that might be worth funding from a grantor's perspective to improve transfer. So this survey was a small piece of the overall environmental scan of transfer that we did. And one of the reasons I wanted to present some of the results of this survey in this session at this conference is the survey was inaugurated at this conference last year. We held a session, we gathered some information on some of the same questions. The survey was sent out as a link to the NISTS members, and so many of you may have had a chance to respond to this survey either in paper at the conference or online. We also gave this survey, or links were sent out for the survey from several state and regional transfer associations. So the New England Transfer Association, the New York State Transfer Association, were among some of the groups that received the link to this survey. So it really was targeted at people like you, at transfer professionals involved in the day-to-day work. We had 154 respondents to the survey. Not all of them completed the survey, as you might imagine, especially when you realize that a large part of the survey were open-ended responses and a small number of fixed responses. So not everybody finished the survey. 113 people got to the fixed responses, which were at the end of the survey. And it seems that we were slightly overrepresented by receiving institutions or four-year institutions. 76% of those people who indicated whether they were from a primarily receiving or a primarily sending institution said they were from a receiving institution. So only 24% from a sending institution. And as I said, we started surveying in February at this conference last year, and the survey went out to groups and concluded in June with the last group, I believe, was a California group of transfers that received that survey. So that's, I think, sufficient on survey background. You know why it was given and a little bit about that. And I want to start off a little bit with some of the data from those fixed questions. But just before I get to that, how many of you think that your institution's commitment to transfer is high? Okay, so not so many of you. How many say it's medium? It's about a medium commitment. All right, more. You have a low commitment at your institution, anybody? Okay, so that seems to be the smallest group. And that's pretty much what matches this question on commitment. The majority of the institutions from which our respondents came were rated as having a medium commitment to transfer. And you can see that certainly medium and high was a little bit better than a low commitment. But the second graph illustrates something that's a little bit more promising. That question had to do with the priority for transfer in the last 3 years. Has it increased? And you can see that it definitely had increased. The priority for transfer was increasing at most of the institutions. Both sectors, the blue lines are the sending institutions, the green lines are the receiving institutions. So you can see a fairly similar response. Transfers becoming more important at both types of institutions, and the priority is increasing. So that is helpful. That's a good thing. A few other things that the institution said. There were, among the fixed choice questions, a number of yes-no questions. Does your institution have and a comprehensive plan to improve transfer? Not so many institutions, either at the 2 or 4 year group, have a comprehensive plan to improve their transfer. A little more positive, slightly over half of the institutions have done something within the last year to improve, or within the last 3 years, to improve transfer on their campus. So they may not have a comprehensive plan, but at least they're doing something. A fairly small percentage, 35% at the sending institutions and 42% at the receiving institutions, said they had a transfer stakeholder group. How many of you have a first-year student stakeholder group? So I think first-year student stakeholder groups, FYE council, some group of people who really focus on improving the first year is much more common than having a group of people on your campus dealing with what's arguably more complex, the transfer group. So consider that a stakeholders group for transfer student issues, and that might put you ahead. We'll talk about that more. Do you have an advocate, somebody who serves that role, either a leader, an advocate for transfer and coordinator of transfer, or office that serves that purpose at your institution? A little over half of the institutions said they had a person or an office. You can see that slightly more common to have an advocate for transfer at the 2-year institution than at the 4-year institution. And a transfer center, which may be the place that that advocate is housed. 42% of the 2-year institutions said they had a transfer center. Only 26% of the respondents from the 4-year institutions. So that central place for transfer information, for students to know where to go to get information about transfer, not so common. As you'll see among the other answers, something that you might want to think about if your institution does not have a transfer center or some office that's central for transfer. So our first question of the survey, the question that led off was, what's most essential to be a transfer student friendly? What is most essential at your institution to be transfer student friendly? And you would think from the way that question's worded, it might prompt you to put down one thing, the most essential thing. Most of the responses to this question were a long paragraph, touching on 4, 5, 6, 7 different things. So it's not just one thing, which certainly fits with our perception that transfer needs to be an institution-wide commitment. It takes all of the offices at the institution, the faculty at the institution, everyone needs to be responsible for transfer. And that, at a bottom line, is kind of what came across in this being a transfer student-friendly institution. So these are sort of in priority of frequency that the responses were given. And not too surprisingly, policies and commitments to credit transfer and transfer pathways come up at the top. So that's not at all a surprise to us. My friend on the NISTS board, Trudy Bears, is always saying, you want to do transfer, give them credit. And that's one of the things that came across in these. And I might mention, most of the bullets here are direct quotes from the responses on the survey. So accept nearly all the credits. Don't limit the credits, were the kinds of things that people were saying. Apply the credits that you accept to general education, to your core, to your major programs. Not a big surprise. Transfer is not just about credits, but transferring the credits is critically important. Give prompt credit evaluation. Don't make the students wait to find out how their credits are going to count at your Institution, if you're a receiving institution. Make sure that they know. Several of the comments said they should know the credit evaluation should be completed before the admissions process is completed. Give quick credit evaluation. I've worked with some institutions whose credit evaluation didn't come until the middle of the first semester the student was enrolled. That's unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. So that's a point that a number of the surveys made. Have clear pathways. Partner on major specific pathways is an important point. Make sure that the students know how their credit counts toward their major, how long it's going to take to get to graduation based on the credits they bring in and the credits that are required at the new institution. So those are some of the major things associated with credits and pathways. But as I said, most of the respondents didn't stop their responses there. So a number talked about communication. And I've already said clear pathways, so clear comes across in a lot of the responses to this survey. Give clear directions about how to transfer, all of the steps of transfer. Have somebody that can explain the process, and certainly provide clear information about how the credits will transfer. Again, kind of repeats that theme throughout. Publicly accessible knowledge, knowing and having access to that information ahead of time, having the availability of the information about transfer easily accessible on the websites. Certainly that is something that we often hear. Transfer students go to the website first thing. That's a place that counselors at the two-year institution also look when they're trying to figure out transfer. So abundant information about transfer at your institution, easily accessible, good communication, clear communication was stressed. Advising, not a big surprise either. Transfer students need to be advised. And instead of putting the quotes here, I just put the major subcategories down for you. Pre-transfer advising, quite a few of the responses talked about making sure that the student at the two-year college is receiving advice early. That can either be from people who are counselors at the two-year institution, advisors at the two-year institution, advisors at the four-year institution who may have offices at the two-year institution, or at least are there frequently enough to provide good advising. Advising not only on courses and course transfer, but also on process and the other kinds of issues that come up in relationship, admission criteria, program admission criteria, as well as institutional admission criteria. Specialized transfer advisors, advisors that really know transfer in and out, are an important part of the advising picture, as well as transitional advising once the student is at their new institution. Transitional advising would also include advising about the procedures at the new institution, as well as the more specific academic advising issues that come across. So orientation type advising, procedural questions would be a part of that transition advising that was mentioned. Transfer services. Here, one of the major things that kept coming across was having a centralized location, having a transfer center, which we saw that not so many of the institutions where the respondents came from had a transfer center, but they thought a transfer center was important. And if you couldn't have a transfer center, several of them mentioned at least have a centralized location for admissions, financial aid, advising, credit evaluation, all of those critical kind of features, so that if it wasn't a transfer center, there at least was only one place to go for this kind of information. Dedicated staff came across in a number of different ways. Having transfer-specific people in the various offices is an important part of that. Having knowledgeable people, not only for the students, but also for the partner institutions to know who to contact for particular kind of information. Those were key components of having dedicated staff. Transfer-specific programming. My first line of bullets are sort of a synthesis of the things that were most often mentioned by the receiving institutions, having a transfer orientation, mentors for transfer students, transfer open house, transfer social events, transfer seminar, and transfer housing, transfer scholarships, all sorts of things that are transfer specific. The sending institutions were more likely to focus on having events that familiarize the student with their transfer options, with their transfer institutions, transfer fairs, transfer week. We've had institutions who had transfer week, not only having the partners on their campus to talk about transfer, but also all the faculty wearing their colors from their institutions and telling their stories if they were transfers. Those kind of things create that sense of awareness. So we can look at a range of having transfer services. Transfer culture. This kind of pulls together a number of themes, but it talks about valuing transfer and valuing transfer students, placing as much emphasis on transfer as you do on first-time students, seeing them as important, making sure that administrators, faculty, and staff all understand their role and responsibilities toward transfer, that transfer is an institution-wide commitment. Having transfer in the mission statements of various offices, just as freshman shows up in those mission statements. Transfer training for faculty and staff. One way to help that transfer culture to develop was mentioned more than once. So this final quote represents those training for transfer. Explaining transfer, one of the things that we often find in working with institutions around transfer is there's very little knowledge outside of one or two offices or the highest administrators about the impact of transfer. That means sending institutions really don't have a good handle often on how many of their students actually transfer, or even how many of their students intend to transfer, the transfer-bound student population, what kind of characteristics. It's not that nobody knows that, but most people don't know that. On the four-year side, how many of the students who come into your institution are transfer students. We've had some institutions when they look at the data that are really surprised, particularly the faculty and staff are really surprised at the high percentage of their students who are actually transfer students when they were going along in the bubble thinking that was a small group. So that kind of training and understanding the success of transfer students can go a long way to helping that culture for transfer on a campus. Equitable policies. Policies was an important category overall, but a number of the responses particularly mentioned equitable policies, making sure that transfer students had the same kind of experiences, but unique to their needs as first-year students. Admissions, scholarships, financial aid. Excuse me. Making sure that there's housing available for transfer students, that they can enroll in classes at the same time as the students who are already at your institution. So providing policies, and you might consider doing a policy audit. What kind of policies do you have in these different offices on your campus, and how do they disadvantage transfer students, or are they equitable policies for transfer students that meet them where they need to be? Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. You can see that that first question, what's most essential, covered a lot. There were a lot of things that are most essential to being transfer student friendly. And I'm going to ask how many of you, when you think about transfer partnerships at your institution, how many of you have 5 or fewer transfer partner institutions? Okay, pretty good smattering. More than 5? Even more. So that is a difficult thing because many of you do have a large number of transfer partners. So how strong would you say your transfer partnerships are? Are your transfer partnerships weak or non-existent? Anybody? No? Oh, that's good. Would you say that the strength of your transfer partnerships is about medium? Yeah? Okay. Okay, by the hands that have gone up so far, I'm guessing that a number of you are going to say your transfer partnerships are strong, right? Okay, some people didn't raise hands. I can tell. There weren't enough hands there. But here's what the respondents from our survey said in terms of the numbers of transfer partners. 76% of the sending institution respondents said they had more than 5. For the receivers, that was 46%, more than 5 transfer partners. So that's common, and that's what we saw among this group, having a large number of transfer partnerships is common. Most of the respondents of the survey indicated that their partnerships were moderate in strength. Moderate was not such a big category in the hands raised, but one of the things that might occur there. Two-year institutions or sending institutions generally perceive their partnerships to be slightly stronger than the 4-year institutions or receiving institutions did. So we ask 2 questions, 2 open-ended questions about partnerships, and they were very similar and led to very similar answers. So I'm just going to kind of combine those. One asked about one replicable approach that you've used or observed that's effective in accomplishing collaboration between transfer partners. The other question was worded more institutionally specific. What is your institution doing that is really working well to accomplish good collaboration with your partners? So those were quite similar questions. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of characteristics that, or things that institutional representatives saw as critical for promoting collaboration with their partners. And the most commonly mentioned items, again, had to do with courses and program, having course articulation agreements with their partners was seen as a very important characteristic. Having clear pathways worked out with the partners so that they knew which courses to advise, which programs, and importantly, and the reason I selected this particular quote was I wanted to mention keeping those agreements up to date. Those pathways agreements, the articulation agreements, sometimes they're not seen as being very effective because curriculums change, and they change fairly regularly, and sometimes an agreement sits on the shelf and doesn't get regularly updated. So having good partners means creating the agreements and keeping those agreements up to date as you go forward. Another step in that, and probably arguably one of the more important steps, is curriculum alignment. And curriculum alignment takes getting faculty together from partner institutions to discuss their courses, to talk about course goals, course objectives, and as my quoted response here, even to get to the point of perhaps talking about common text. So that kind of making sure that those articulated courses really are meeting the goals for both course-to-course articulations and for those pathways that the students are going to be entering into, takes that faculty-to-faculty conversation, and that's an important component of the agreements around courses and programs. Again, there were lots of comments about courses and programs. 2+2 program arrangements, 3+2 program arrangements, fairly commonly mentioned. This one comment mentions we have 50 2+2 programs. That struck me as a particularly large number, ambitious, and having agreements that included reverse transfer was also mentioned quite a few times. So as we look at that, that is a part of the agreements. Building relationships was one of the categories that comes across important. If you're going to have a partner, you have to build the relationships with those partners. Relationships, as we all know on a personal level, take work. And they take, in transfer partnerships, working with a variety of people at different levels. So administrators, faculty, and staff all need to be included in building the relationships and having regular meetings. There were a number of comments about regular meetings, and regular meant different things to different institutions. Monthly meetings, it may mean different things, as my second quote suggests, for different groups, more regular for some groups than others within this range of having groups come together to talk and making sure that there's this ongoing kind of communication. And treating partners well is at least the way that I categorized some of those responses, but that had to do with making sure that working with the partners meant you kept the needs of both institutions in mind. And that might include things like reverse transfer to help the sending institution receive credit for the associate degrees, but making sure that the partnership is advantageous for both sides is certainly part of that, building that relationship. Staffing for transfer, there was quite a bit of response about having staff from the four-year partner institutions on the campus of the two-year institution. These are just a couple of examples. We have transfer advisor from the local four-year campus on our two-year campus every day. And in some cases, if an institution is large enough, they may have a full-time staff at their partner institution. Some institutions can't afford that, don't have that luxury, but having a person on the two-year campus on a regular basis certainly helps with maintaining those relationships. Having a dedicated staff, again, up in another context, making sure that there's someone that the partner institution knows they can go to for questions or can send students to get answers to their questions was mentioned a number of times. And internal or external training, that's mentioned, looked at a variety of partnership issues, but making sure that people at the partner institutions knew the procedures, the changes in curriculum, et cetera, was a big part of that. But internal training within the institution, particularly within the receiving institution, so that you continued to maintain the importance of those partners to your institution. Now, this is kind of my final major segment here, and state policy. We asked several questions about state policy, but I wanted to focus on the question that asked about beneficial state policies, as not all state policies are seen as beneficial. And we did have a question on that if you want, but which policies that states have encourage or helpful in encouraging and enabling transfer. The main responses here were about statewide policies associated with credit, statewide articulation agreements for courses, the acceptance of core or general education as a block. They might not necessarily be the same courses, but if you take 42 hours in this block of courses, then they're going to count for core or general education. That kind of statewide policy, kind of a step up from that is the Common Core state policy. Now, when states have these agreements, several of the responses mentioned on the negative side, not all the players play equally fair in some states, but the state policy is still beneficial. So even if not everybody's a good player, it's helpful to have those. Curriculum pathways, a number of states are working with faculty from a variety of institutions to build out curriculum pathways. and that's seen as beneficial. Common course numbering, a number of states have common course numbering. Guaranteed admissions with an associate's or with a block of credit. If you were in the previous session, we heard an example of that guaranteed admission kind of approach, and reverse transfer policies. So beneficial state policies mainly were seen as those policies that guarantee students can take their credit with them, the credit can count, and are facilitating those things, whether they work as well as intended or not. Those are seen as beneficial. A number of the responses, instead of explaining particular beneficial state policies, some of them just mentioned states. Maybe they were getting tired by here. They would, sometimes they said, California and Florida have good policies. They're beneficial. So these states were mentioned multiple times, and in the context of having these particular policies in place. Certainly many other states have these policies. These just happen to be the ones that people thought of, either if they were from the state. I don't think that we targeted transfer professionals from Ohio, but Ohio was the most frequently mentioned among the states. But this is just a sampling. I thought it might be useful anyway to see which of those policies were seen as, which of those states were seen as having particularly valuable policies. And if your state doesn't, and one of these captures your imagination, you can go look them up as you might go. Anybody have a guess about what kind of policies weren't beneficial? Know of any that aren't beneficial? Not, see. The ones that most frequently were not beneficial had to do with budget and finance constraints, constraints on credit hours, those kind of things which disadvantage transfer students and transfer. But I didn't put a slide on those. So just to kind of bring this to a closure, successful transfer requires an entire institutional involvement. It's a commitment of people at all levels of the institution to encourage students to transfer, whether you're a faculty member at a community college or an administrator at a four-year institution, or wherever your role happens to be. Transfer is part of your responsibility, particularly in these days when we have such glaring issues of social justice, and that more and more students are being pushed by their states in many cases to start at community college, and that means we need that institution-wide commitment. So I'd be happy to take some questions if there are any, and If you want more information, my colleague Mike Rosenberg, who worked intensely with the survey data too, is here in the audience. I'm sure he could shed some light on some other aspects as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. And have a great conference.